Kelly Link is a writer who began her career very firmly in the genre context as a writer of fantasy, horror, science fiction, went on to get very widespread, very powerful mainstream acclaim, including a MacArthur Genius Grant, but has remained identified with the genre writing community, who still identifies herself strongly and centrally as a writer of fantasy, horror, and science fiction. There are other writers, a few, who have managed to break out of the so-called genre ghetto, a very old term inside science fiction itself, who've managed to break out from the genre world into the mainstream world and have left and not looked back and become mainstream writers. Those people will go unnamed, at least in this video. I'm not saying anything about others. Link doesn't disidentify with the genre. She has not left the genre behind. She remains where she has always been, doing the work that is most artistically and emotionally rewarding to her. Which clearly, now, she clearly has a mainstream following. Link has readers who don't generally read or who look down on, in some cases, more generic forms of fantasy, science fiction, and horror. People who would not, there is a readership for Link who would not otherwise be messing with genre books at all, who don't count her as in the genre. But she counts herself as in the genre. She has a MacArthur Genius Grant, as I've already mentioned. The stories in the collection we're reading for class, let's see. Yes. Let's see, make sure my camera doesn't auto-correct away the light so it becomes illegible. My camera only thinks it's smart. The stories in Get in Trouble, her fourth and most recent collection, are mostly published in very high-end literary magazines. Magazines like Tin House, McSweeney's, A Public Space, very prestigious, award-winning, hard to get into journals with enormous mainstream literary cred. Interestingly, Link does very well with the leading journals that have been founded in the last 20 years or so. She seems to do very, very well with the newer top-end journals. A lot of her key publications happen there. Another example would be the magazine One Story. But a few of these, a couple of these stories, one is from one is previously unpublished, that would be The Lesson. One is from an online science fiction magazine that I don't believe exists anymore, Subterranean Online. Two are from original genre anthologies, in some ways the nerdiest and most science fiction-y of all science fiction publications, the original anthology. Then our next video, we'll talk a lot about the role, the very special role that the short story has in science fiction's history and in science fiction's sense of itself as a genre. So stay tuned for that. After these stories were published, Link has published, I think her most recent story to my knowledge is in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which is as clearly identified with the genre as the name Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction implies. Why can Link have it both ways? Or what is she doing? What is she writing? This is something that is variously called slipstream, meaning something that slips between genre and literary writing and does both, as opposed to mainstream. It is slipstream, sometimes called magical realism. There are some other names. We can get hung up on the names too much, as with other terms for subgenres. These are tools, but they shouldn't bind us too much. And there are arguments about all these terms. The name magical realism comes with an argument about whether people outside the original colonized Latin American context can write it, because it begins with people like Garcia Marquez. I don't have time in this video for that, and I think I'm not going to have time to make a video about that. The name game is misleading at times. It is clear that what Link is doing uses the full toolkit of both science fiction, fantasy, horror. We got a bunch of ghosts and some vampires and some demons You can make it, there are some quotation marks around the vampires, but you get the idea. And the full toolkit of high-end literary fiction. She is having it both ways and is satisfying to readers who prefer both genres. Also, realizing as I make this video, I really, really hope she never sees this. Okay, what does this mean in practice? These stories tend to be based on character growth. The plot is more interior, more internal than external. What happens in these stories tends to be what happens inside the character. Link has a bunch of flashy plot incidents, but the stories are not plot driven in the sense that an external plot resolution will solve everything and wrap it up. We don't have time in a short story, or at least in a Link short story, to get wrapped up in like who will find the lost ark and whose face will melt and who will get the MacGuffin and who will get the gold and oh my god, and who will beat the level boss in a sword fight. We're just not doing that. I would actually argue that the two stories that seem to be most plot centric, that tend to end in the most plotty way, are the ones are also the outliers, and that they tend to have the two male point of view characters, and we can remark on how unlovely those male viewpoint characters are, as opposed to the female viewpoint characters we see through most of the rest of the novel. I'm living out from the lesson. I'm thinking of Valley of the Girls, and of course, I can see right through you. There's a clear plot resolution at the end of those. But with a story like Secret Identity, the alleged plot MacGuffin, let's go to town and let's go to the big city and meet Paul Zell, never happens. Things happen. Things happen to our heroine. Things happen inside her. There are major changes, but they're not changes about meeting a clearly delineated external goal. These stories do not set themselves up as saying, hey, get this thing and then you'll be happy. A story like The New Boyfriend is really about our heroine going through a phase. And going through a phase like, will she get the new boyfriend? Will she not get the boyfriend? Should she not do that? The story doesn't pay off in a plot sense, because in the end, what's most important isn't what happens with the toy boyfriend robot that she is temporarily stealing from her best friend. What's happening is her relationship with her friends, her relationship with herself, her relationship with desire, and with the possibility of heterosexuality at all. We can talk more about that on our discussion boards and on Collaborate chat. Link is also setting herself apart with really, really good prose. The prose is very high quality. One of the hallmarks of Link's style, especially in her earlier work, but now still, is a heavy use of very imaginative similes. A lot of likes, a lot as, like this, still as milk, like a bruise. They're surprising, they're innovative, they're not expected. One of the things that keeps this feeling fresh and alive is the language is fresh and alive, that you don't get the figuration that you expected to have. But it makes sense once you hear it. I'd also point out her early and continuing emphasis on the simile as opposed to the metaphor is because, of course, she's writing fantasy, horror, and science fiction, where a lot of the metaphor is literalized on a plot level. Metaphor is actually very tricky for science fiction and fantasy writers because it can be misleading about what is actually happening in the imagined world of the story. A description that just describes something as like something else is easy to understand as a metaphor in realist fiction when we know that one thing is not another. Much trickier in a world where impossible things happen all the time. Hence, our friend, the simile. Clearly a comparison, not literally like that. The sky is not a big bruise. The sky is like a bruise, because in these stories, anything goes. Also, Link tends to be highly inventive. She tends to reuse and bring new, fresh life out of kind of a lot of existing genre tropes. Um, she loves her ghost story. She loves having an imaginative world that her characters inhabit, where doing a plot thing about that world is not really the thing. The heroine of Secret Identity goes to town and finds herself in a hotel overrun with superheroes and dentists. Not because she's looking to be a superhero and there's no superhero plot, there's no crime stopping, but because her kind of boy girl, ill conceived online relationship that needs to now happen in the real world, or shouldn't, but they need to have a face to face meeting, gets sidetracked into this environment. They're just around there. Think of the protagonist of Light looking at the mermaids swimming in the canal. The mermaids have nothing to do with the action of the story. You're just in a world where there are mermaids, where people have an extra shadow, where your twin brother, who could just be a twin brother, is a kind of shadow twin who grew out of your additional shadow. These imaginative metaphors create a kind of lived-in world for these characters. Um, I would also point out one of the hallmarks of Link's storytelling style is the story within a story. Look at how many times characters tell each other a ghost story or some other kind of story, that if there are narratives inside narratives in relatively short texts. Even in moments when there isn't a story within a story per se, there's a lot of information release by people, characters narrating things later. In a story like The Summer People, there's a bunch of that's been going on with Fran's father before the story opens that we get later narrated to us by a supporting character. So look for the story within stories, look for the kind of use of a lived in, we just happen to exist living a normal human life in a world with supernatural things. Um, Look for those beautiful similes and that incredibly balanced poetic language. And why are short stories so important? On to the next video. Live long and prosper.